This is not a story about gentlemen fighting a conventional war. This is the story of total attrition, fanaticism squared, and the moment one nation decided to wake up the largest industrial machine the world had ever known. If you thought the European theater was tough, you have no idea what was brewing in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific. Because when you look at the names Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, you are not looking at battles. You are looking at meat grinders. You are looking at places where the very soil ran red with blood, where men fought and died for rocks that offered nothing but a terrifying view of the next stretch of ocean. And the horrifying truth is, none of it had to happen. This is the story of the Pacific War, the fatal miscalculation that changed warfare forever. For decades, the United States and Japan had been on a collision course. Japan, an island nation, had imperial aspirations and a desperate, terrifying dependency on foreign resources, chiefly oil and steel. The United States, after watching Japan ruthlessly expand across Asia, finally decided enough was enough. In 1941, the US slapped a crippling oil embargo on Japan. It was a stranglehold. Japan had two choices: surrender their imperial dreams and withdraw, or strike a decisive blow before their fuel tanks ran dry. They chose the latter. Now, pause and think about the audacity, the sheer, terrifying hubris of attacking the most powerful nation on Earth. The mastermind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, knew exactly what they were doing. He famously said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto understood the imbalance. Japan's plan was never to defeat the US outright. That was impossible. Their goal was a knockout punch: Pearl Harbor. They wanted to destroy the Pacific Fleet, demoralize America, and force a negotiated peace deal that would leave their territorial gains intact. On December 7th, 1941, they got their knockout punch. In less than 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were dead, and the pride of the US Navy lay burning and sunk in the shallow waters of Hawaii. It was a stunning success, a tactical masterpiece. But strategically, it was suicide. The Japanese high command made three critical, life-ending mistakes that day. First, they failed to hit the massive fuel storage tanks, meaning the US logistical spine remained intact. Second, they missed the repair facilities, meaning the ships they did sink could be salvaged and returned to service. And the third, most fatal mistake, they missed the carriers. The USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, the real arbiters of naval power in the modern age, were all out to sea. And the war that followed would be decided not by the battleships lying on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, but by the air power those carriers projected. The giant was awake, and it was absolutely furious. The initial months of 1942 were a relentless Japanese blitzkrieg. They swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore. The Allies were reeling. It felt like Japan was unstoppable. But in the intelligence rooms across the Pacific, a quiet, desperate battle was being won. US Navy cryptographers, operating under absolute secrecy, had cracked the Japanese naval codes known as JN-25B. This intelligence advantage was the greatest secret weapon of the Pacific War. And it all led to one place: Midway Atoll. Japan mobilized a massive fleet, intending to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle and finish what they started at Pearl Harbor. But the US knew the plan. They knew the dates, they knew the targets, and crucially, they knew the precise moment the Japanese would be vulnerable while rearming their aircraft. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, was decided in minutes. In a flurry of devastating air attacks, the US managed to sink 4 of Japan's fleet carriers: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hairyu. 4 carriers gone, thousands of elite airmen, irreplaceable assets gone. Midway wasn't just a victory, it was an amputation. Japan had lost the ability to project strategic offensive power. They were forced onto the defensive. And here is where the critical strategic difference between the two nations became clear. When the US lost a carrier, they had a factory ready to churn out 2 more. When Japan lost a carrier, the skilled labor pool, the resources, and the industrial infrastructure simply could not replace it. America's true weapon wasn't the Sherman tank or the Hellcat fighter. It was the ability to build an entire aircraft carrier in 6 months. It was the vast, unforgiving, relentless power of American industry. With the strategic initiative gone, Japan dug in. And this is where the war shifted from fleet maneuvering to pure, horrifying attrition. This is where the concept of island hopping was born. The US couldn't afford to take every single Japanese-held island. It was too costly, too slow. So, they established a strategy: seize key strategic islands, usually those that could host an airbase and bypass the others, letting them wither on the vine. But even the chosen islands were pure hell. The first taste came at Guadalcanal in 1942. 6 months of brutal, close-quarters jungle warfare. The men who survived called it the Green Hell. It wasn't just fighting the enemy. It was fighting disease, starvation, torrential rain, and heat stroke. If Guadalcanal was brutal, Tarawa, a tiny coral atoll seized in 1943, was pure, unadulterated savagery. The problem was doctrine. Japanese soldiers were taught to fight to the last man. Surrender was not an option. It was a disgrace. This meant every single engagement became an extermination campaign. At Tarawa, 4,500 Japanese defenders were present. Only 17 survived capture. Think about that casualty ratio. It fundamentally changed the calculus of war for the US command. They realized that every island assault would involve near-total annihilation of the enemy, resulting in horrifying casualties for the Marines. The island hopping campaign became a contest of infrastructure versus ideology. The Japanese had ideology, Bushido, absolute loyalty, the willingness to die for the emperor. The Americans had infrastructure, Seabees who could carve airstrips out of jungles in weeks, landing vehicles, LVTs, that could cross treacherous reefs, and a logistical pipeline that delivered endless fuel, ammunition, and fresh troops. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about the continuous, crushing application of industrial might. They were fighting a nation that could take 1,000 casualties today and replace those troops and equipment by next week. Japan couldn't. As the Americans closed in on the Japanese home islands, the fighting became exponentially more savage. The psychological desperation of the Japanese military led to the deployment of the most terrifying weapon of the war, the kamikaze, young pilots, strapped into planes loaded with explosives, flying one-way suicide missions into American ships. It was terrifying, demoralizing, and yet another sign of a military doctrine prioritizing fanatical self-sacrifice over strategic thinking. Then came Iwo Jima in early 1945, a desolate, black volcanic island. 22,000 Japanese defenders were dug into miles of tunnels and fortified positions. The U.S. planners expected a 5-day fight. It lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed, securing that small patch of dirt. The cost was astronomical. The ratio of Japanese killed to American wounded was unbelievable. And if Iwo Jima was bad, Okinawa, the last major island stand, was worse. It was the prelude to the invasion of Japan itself. Okinawa saw 12,000 American casualties and over 100,000 Japanese military dead, plus tens of thousands of civilians who were often encouraged to commit suicide rather than surrender. The casualty figures were staggering. The U.S. High Command faced a horrific dilemma: Operation Downfall. The planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. Estimates predicted that invading Japan would cost anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Allied casualties and potentially 10 million Japanese military and civilian deaths. President Truman was presented with a calculus of unspeakable horror: continue the conventional path of invasion or deploy the most devastating weapon ever conceived. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay delivered the first atomic weapon, Little Boy, over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. The debate over the morality of the bomb continues to this day. But for the men waiting on transport ships, training for the invasion of Kyushu, the bombs were salvation. They instantly achieved what months of firebombing and years of brutal land war could not: unconditional surrender. The Pacific War ended not with a grand final battle, but with 2 blinding flashes of light, demonstrating the terrifying technological acceleration of total war. The Pacific War was a conflict driven by ideological fervor, colliding head-on with industrial reality. Japan's initial success was stunning, based on speed, shock, and fanatical belief. But their strategy ignored the long game. They attacked the U.S. Navy, but they inadvertently declared war on Detroit, Pittsburgh, and the massive logistical engine of American ingenuity. The legacy of the Pacific War is a stark lesson in strategic calculus. It showed the world that in a total war scenario, the ability to rapidly produce and deploy sophisticated technology outweighs zealotry every single time. It cemented the aircraft carrier as the ultimate weapon of the 20th century, and most importantly, it showed the terrifying, limitless scale of human cost when the doctrine of no surrender meets the technology of total annihilation. We must never forget the sheer depth of sacrifice required to win those desolate patches of Earth.